I suppose I could say that it was a happy coincidence that today's theme is coming home. Our worship and music ministry team wasn't reflecting on the reality that a group of us would be heading off someplace and would be coming back home. They just noted that in our first reading, the people of Israel are finally settling into their new home, the Promised Land, and that Paul, in our second reading, is speaking of reconciliation, what true home is about, and that the son in Luke, who has run from home, is now coming back home. They noted all of that, and they couldn't help but say, we need to operate with the theme, coming home. But what a happy accident that those of us who've been away from home on what some people call a pilgrimage get today to be reminded of the significance of coming home. Truthfully, I'm glad to be home. I am glad to be back in my bed that is not as stiff as the one in the hotel we stayed in Bethlehem. I'm ready to be back among you, the hometown folks. Yes, if you know me, you know I love to travel. And a trip like this is life-changing, not simply because in it we got to see the sights of Israel and Palestine, got to walk where Jesus walked, got to participate in the narrative that is our people's big story, but because we encountered lively and life-filled people and cultures that are not our own, but nonetheless who did their very best to make us feel at home. For our particular experience, this was especially true of the Palestinian people who hosted us and led us. Their hospitality was beyond compare, even though I have to say life for many of them is not easy. The experience of their hospitality gave me a different framework to process this marvelous story of the Father and his sons that we have in Luke today, since Middle Eastern culture is the context for this particular story. Some recent scholarship, biblical scholarship, has suggested that the stories, that we call them parables of Jesus, are often appropriated differently based on the cultural context of those who are reading or experiencing them. And for example, Americans, when they hear or read the parable of the father and his two sons, often focus on the first son who has gone astray, since Americans are so shaped by our puritanical background. That background has given us such a strong emphasis on personal misbehavior or private morality. We are in some ways culturally wired to hear this story as a reflection on what happens when individuals go bad. We even speak of our kids or other families' kids as the ones who are prodigals. Evidently, if you go to Africa and they hear this story, they focus on the fact that there was a great famine and that the famine changed everything. Africans know what famine's all about. Because Jesus was a Palestinian Jew from Middle Eastern culture, and because I just spent 10 days participating in Middle Eastern culture, I want that cultural lens to shape the story as it comes at us today. The culture of Jesus' day and the culture of the Palestinians we confronted these past 2 weeks are communal cultures. Communal cultures shaped not so much by individual choice, but by familial expectation, by a concern for the family's reputation, by a commitment to respect the oldest in the family, and by a great desire to not bring shame on the family. Once in a while, I must admit, and maybe this is just the fact that I'm getting older, I wonder if we wouldn't be served by a little more of this cultural ethos. When the son asks for his inheritance from his father, while the father is still alive, he's treating the father as if he is already dead, as if the man he is to respect the most does not matter to him. His actions not only bring shame on himself, but to the whole family, and in particular bring shame on the father. Can this father not control his son? Is his family so out of control that the father has to subsidize the son's wild, disrespectful ways? It is not simply that the son has misbehaved, but that he has brought shame onto his whole family. And nothing could be worse. And the father has every right to dismiss this son forever. This son should be truly dead to him. But you must understand, this is a different kind of father. This is a wild, extravagant, the word we use, prodigal father. This is not a story about the prodigal son. This is a story about the prodigal father. When he hears that his once dead son has come to his senses and is choosing to return to his family and father, the father does a rather bizarre thing, a rather shameful thing, actually. He runs toward the son to greet him and then embraces him. That would have been a shameful thing for the father to do. No self-respecting father would do such a thing. A self-respecting, shame-aware father would have stayed put and would have waited until the son came to him, who should be coming to him by groveling as he's approaching his father. Well, the son in the story does his well-practiced groveling. He's practiced his lines before he comes. He does his well-practiced groveling, but the father who has run after him seems to have no need for the groveling. All right, talk about how you have erred against me, but I'm not there anymore. The father moves way beyond the shame. Shame, be shamed. He's just filled with joy, because his son who once was dead now is alive. His son who once was lost now is found. The only thing you do at this point is to throw a party to welcome the son back with the greatest of hospitality. You cannot hang out where we've hung out for the last 10 days and not be overwhelmed by Middle Eastern hospitality. Our Palestinian friends showered us with food, wine, gifts for me, gifts for my wife, gifts for all of us, special treats like bananas from Jericho, knock you off your feet cognac, and my favorite, baklava. If we needed to go to the bank, they'd take us. If some of us needed to not walk so much, they would make arrangements for transportation for us. Extravagant hospitality, prodigal hospitality is a way of life for these folks. And extravagant, prodigal hospitality is the way of our God. That is the point of the story today. God moves beyond the shame. God doesn't operate with a scorecard like we do. God is even willing to put his reputation on the line to the point where we might say, oh, what kind of God are you who welcomes sinners and eats with them? I mean, really? Shouldn't you in your godness stay put and wait until broken and shameful sinners come groveling to you? Well, if the life of Jesus is any indication, then no, our God is not a God who stays put. A God who in his godness folds his arm and waits until us shameful folks come groveling at his feet. The big story of the universe is a story of a God who comes running after us, who in Jesus throws an over-the-top party for the whole world, slaughtering the best calf, serving the best wine, clothing us in the finest robes of his delight. The big story of our life together is a story of grace, a story of welcome, a story of homecoming, a story of amazing reconciliation. Paul, in today's second reading, says that this story of reconciliation means that everything is different. In fact, he says that in Jesus, the embodied story of God's grace, there's a whole new creation, a whole new way of doing things, a whole new way of viewing life and people. Now, Paul says, we regard no one from a human point of view. Because of God's grace and reconciliation, we view people through God's work of reconciliation. God has reconciled himself to us. We then, Paul says, are given the ministry of reconciliation, the ministry of bringing people together. In Palestine and Israel, there are a lot of divisions, a lot of people separated one from another. Sadly, the place that is often called the Holy Land is a torn-apart land. Judaism, Islam, and Christianity all have claims on this land. They all have holy spaces and places that, frankly, have become too important to all of them. When you think that a particular place is your special holy place, you have a hard time sharing with others who claim the holiness of the same place for themselves. There is a lot of division in the Holy Land, and frankly, often caused by religion. And there's a lot of injustice there, too. We were exposed to the injustice experienced by the Palestinians. What many of them have to endure because of who they are and where they live is horrible. Ask any of us about this experience. We experience what many of them must do in order to get to work. Just to get to work. The checkpoints that they have to go through, the walking that they must do, the early time that they must rise to process, to be able to be processed to enter into Israel for their jobs. Many of us Americans have no idea how easy our lives are, how few hassles we go through on a daily basis. The kind of injustice endured by many Palestinians does not represent the hospitality of our God. This kind of injustice does not coincide with the reconciliation that is God's work among us. God is reconciling the world to himself, Paul says. Life is fundamentally about the grace that welcomes and provides a good and joyous home for all of us. Unjust treatment of people, whether they be Palestinians or Ukrainians, is not in keeping with what God is up to in the world, with the hospitable home that is God's gift to us. Now, I have to tell you, I wrote this sermon while I was on the long plane ride. And if you're tall like me, plane rides are not real exciting. About this long plane ride from Istanbul to Chicago. And I wrote it, and I added a few more points, and I was finished. I then, in order to help pass the time, I was really not comfortable, decided I'd watch a movie, which is not something I do too often. And I decided to watch a movie called Mass. I was attracted by the title. I'm a religious geek, forgive me. Mass is a story about two couples who, through the efforts of a social worker, meet to deal with the hardness of the heart that they have for each other. One couple were the parents of a young man who had been murdered by the other couple's son in a mass school shooting in which 10 young people were killed. The whole movie was the conversation that they had one afternoon. The conversation was full of awkwardness, silence, anger, and deep, unfathomable pain. The angst and the hurt were palpable. The most poignant comment came from the mother of the murdered son, who said to the murderer's parents, "I thought if I forgave you," and this was so insightful, "I thought if I forgave you, I would forever lose my son." That is to say, my anger and my bitterness keep him alive. They defend his memory. Now, the conversation they had eventually led to a good place. It wasn't the place, by the way, of cheeriness or ease. It wasn't the inevitable Hollywood happy ending, but it was a place of hope. a place of reconciliation. Eventually, the mothers hugged each other, received the pain that both of them as mothers knew, cried in each other's arms because both of them were experiencing deep, deep pain. Both couples left the conversation, and here's the significant thing, with an openness to a future for their relationship. And truthfully, a new and more life-giving future for themselves. Anger is a dead-end road. Bitterness is a dead-end road. That new future, though, didn't come easy. Oh, you got to watch the movie. It's really tremendous. It did not come easy. Discovering home, living into the reconciliation that is God's gift to us, doesn't come easy. Paul, as he speaks of reconciliation, tells us about the cross, the death of Jesus, the focus of Lent. For him, the cross is at the center of what brings reconciliation, which I think is his way of saying that reconciliation is hard work. It can be a little bloody sometimes. And the movie was called Mass. Not simply because it was dealing with a mass shooting, but also, I'm convinced, because the meeting of the couples took place in a Catholic church where Mass is celebrated. And the Mass is fundamentally about the sacrifice of Jesus, his cross. What was happening among the couples was what Mass is all about when it's understood well. It was hard work, sacrificial work, cross work. Reconciliation sometimes means you and what you cling to have to die. Coming home, as the story about the father and his two sons demonstrates, sometimes means you got to get over yourself. I'm glad to be back home. And I am really glad to be able to proclaim that in God we meet in Jesus, there is home for everybody. Amazing hospitality. So why not enjoy the party? Don't be like that nasty old son who just has to whine and complain because somebody else got something that he didn't get. Enjoy the party. Enjoy the reconciliation. But recognize that reconciliation may be some of the toughest stuff you will ever be involved in. But it also may be the sweetest thing you will ever experience, because it will be a God experience. After all, our God is extravagant in love and in grace.